Atlanta International Airport, 6:03 a.m. A crowd of travelers moves like a tide beneath the harsh terminal lights. The camera jolts into the chaos at crew security. Right in the middle, a circle forms. Phones raised, whispers spreading. An old black man in a crisp pilot's uniform stands alone. Next to him, a tall white woman in her 40s points at his badge, her voice echoing for all to hear. "Excuse me, sir, but this ID doesn't look right. Are you actually cleared to fly this morning? Security, can we get some help over here?" Passengers stop in their tracks. Some record, others just gawk. The man's face, lined with decades of discipline, fatigue, and pride, tightens, but he says nothing. He glances down at the silver captain's wings pinned to his chest, then up at the ring of faces waiting for him to crack. A teenage boy whispers, "Is he really a pilot? Or is this one of those airport scam stories?" The security guard, barely older than the man's grandson, steps up and takes the badge. "Name, sir?" "Captain Harold Gaines," the old man replies, voice quiet, but unbroken. "Employee number 2145, Delta, 52 years. He stares directly at the guard, refusing to flinch. The guard nods, looking uncomfortable. The woman, Linda Cook, flight attendant supervisor, leans closer. "You know, Captain Gaines, aviation's changed. Maybe you haven't noticed, but some of us don't feel so safe with unusual cases in the cockpit." A few people stifle laughs. Someone murmurs, "How old is that guy?" Another, "Didn't even know black pilots could get that senior." All this in less than 30 seconds. And for Harold Gaines, it's just the beginning. He remembers a time when people looked at him and saw a miracle. One of the first black captains in the Southeast, the man who landed Flight 2029 and saved everyone on board back in '92. Today, at 74, with knees aching and hands still steady, he's become an oddity, or worse, a target. As Linda continues her performative concern, Harold studies her. He's flown with Linda before, always formal, always cold, but never this openly hostile. Maybe she's just having a bad day. Or maybe, Harold thinks, she's decided to daze the day she finally pushes him out for good. "Is there a problem here?" another crew member asks, trying to cut the tension. Linda waves her away. "No problem, just verifying for everyone's safety. You don't mind, do you, Captain?" Harold holds her gaze. "Do what you need, Ms. Cook." Security finally hands back the badge. "Everything checks out, Captain." But Linda snatches the paperwork and, still loud, says, "We'll see about that at dispatch. Wouldn't want any mistakes in the log. Atlanta can't afford another headline." The humiliation burns, not just because it's public, but because Harold can feel the old shame and anger coiling inside. The same feeling he knew as a rookie, told to wait outside while the real pilots got their assignments. Only this time, no one steps in to help. He's alone in a sea of colleagues and strangers. He collects his things and walks away, forcing himself not to limp, not to show pain. In the staff lounge, the whispers continue. Someone is already uploading the confrontation to the crew's private group chat. Harold's phone buzzes. A text from his wife. "You okay, Harry? Did they give you trouble again?" He types, then erases his reply. He stares at a number in his contacts. Denise Allen, Mayor. He hasn't spoken to her in years, not since the day he pulled her daughter out of that burning wreck. Maybe now's the time. Maybe he'll need a miracle himself. He settles by the window, watching the runways light up. For a moment, the old pride flickers. How many lives has he protected? How many storms has he flown through while others stayed home? He reminds himself he's more than a rumor, more than the color of his skin, more than his age. But as he sits in that cold, crowded room, Captain Harold Gaines knows. Today, for the first time in his life, he's not sure he belongs here. Not because of the years on his badge or the silver in his hair, but because the world he helped build now seems ready to cast him out, unless he finds a way to fight back. And in the palm of his hand, his phone vibrates again. Maybe, just maybe, one call can change everything. The echo of Linda's words still hung in Harold's ears as he sat by the window of the crew lounge, staring out at the runways shimmering in the early Atlanta sun. He sipped lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup. Black, one cream, just the way he liked it. But this morning, the taste was all wrong, tainted by humiliation and memory. For a moment, Harold closed his eyes and let himself drift back in time. He was no longer the old man in the lounge or the subject of whispered doubts. He was a young pilot in a crisp new uniform. Hands steady on the yoke, heart pounding with hope and nerves as he made his approach to land at Atlanta. He remembered the way the white captains would look at him, some with open skepticism, others with a kind of grudging respect. He remembered the first time a flight attendant asked, "Are you sure you're supposed to be in here?" And he remembered what it felt like to walk out of the cockpit, proud and tall, knowing that every safe landing chipped away at those walls. The photo in his wallet was creased and faded now, but Harold could see it in his mind as clear as ever. Him, 30 years old, grinning, surrounded by the crew of Flight 229. The day he landed that crippled jet in a thunderstorm, saving 187 souls, including a 10-year-old girl who would grow up to become Atlanta's mayor. That moment was covered in the papers, on the news, even in the industry magazines. For a brief window in time, he was more than just a black pilot. He was a hero. But as the years passed, the story faded. New pilots came in. Old legends became just stories told over cheap airport beers, and Harold, never one to brag, folded up his newspaper clippings and put his medals in a shoebox at home. The work mattered. That was enough, or so he thought. The crew lounge this morning felt different, colder somehow. There were eyes on him, young pilots, fresh from the regional lines, whispering as they pretended to check their phones. "That's him, right? The one from the video Linda posted?" one asked, barely bothering to lower his voice. "Yeah," another said. "Heard the company's finally reviewing his status? About time, right? He's been flying since before my dad was born." Harold kept his gaze fixed on the tarmac, jaw clenched. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such talk, but it was the first time he felt so utterly alone, even surrounded by his people. The fraternity of flight had always been thin for men like him, but he'd made it work. He'd earned his place with sweat, silence, and the steady proof of his work. The door opened and a much younger co-pilot, Jack Remington, strolled in with a bounce in his step. Jack was the kind of pilot who'd already been profiled in a business magazine. Handsome, white, Yale grad, his Instagram packed with adventure shots and motivational quotes. He gave Harold a curt nod, then took a seat on the opposite side of the room. "Morning, Captain Gaines," he said. Tone polite, but empty. Harold nodded back, saying nothing. He was tired of the dance, the forced camaraderie that meant little once the rumors started flying. A few seats away, two flight attendants giggled over a phone. One of them scrolled past a meme, Harold's picture, photoshopped with a cane, and the caption, "Still flying or just napping in the cockpit." He tried to ignore it, but the ache settled deeper in his chest. Where was the loyalty, the respect? Did half a century mean nothing in the face of gossip and fear? He pressed his hand to his chest, feeling for the shape of the tiny medal beneath his shirt, a reminder that once people believed in him. But medals didn't stop the world from moving on. Harold's phone vibrated. It was a text from his daughter. "Dad, saw something about you online. Are you okay? Should we talk?" He hesitated, not wanting to worry her. He typed back, "I'm fine. Just airport drama. Nothing new. Love you." He slipped the phone away, glancing at the number for Denise Allen in his contacts, the now mayor of Atlanta. He could see her as a child, clutching her mother's hand, tear-stained face after the rescue. Denise had sent him a card every year on the anniversary for 2 decades. Then, the calls stopped. She was busy, he told himself. Important people always were. Was it pride that kept him from reaching out now? Or fear that maybe she too had forgotten? He looked around the lounge, feeling the distance widen between him and everyone else. The world seemed to shrink to this single, suffocating room, the walls closing in with every silent judgment. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight crew for 4427, report to dispatch." Harold stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door. As he passed Jack and the others, no one spoke. No one offered a nod or a word of encouragement. It was as if he were already gone. In the hallway, a maintenance worker, an older black man with silver hair and oil stains on his uniform, caught Harold's eye. For a brief moment, there was recognition, a flicker of shared struggle. The man gave Harold a small, knowing nod, the kind of gesture that said, "I see you. I know what you've survived." Harold felt a lump form in his throat and nodded back. He reached the dispatch desk. Linda was waiting, arms crossed, lips pursed, radiating irritation. She handed him his paperwork without looking at him. "Just sign here, Captain Gaines. Then you can be on your way." Her words were icy, but Harold heard something else beneath them. Fear. Was it possible that all this was about more than just age or color? Was Linda afraid of losing control, of seeing her version of order in aviation slip away? Harold signed, handed the clipboard back, and met her eyes. "I've been on my way for a long time, Ms. Cook. You have a safe flight." He walked toward the jet bridge, feeling the weight of 50 years pressing down on his shoulders. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the ache and humiliation, something else flickered, a stubborn resolve. He might be alone right now. He might be the last of a dying breed. But he wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Atlanta, painting the tarmac gold. And for a fleeting second, Harold remembered what it felt like to fly, free, proud, unstoppable. Maybe, just maybe, today wasn't the end after all. For Captain Harold Gaines, the walk down the jet bridge was always a ritual, a chance to shed the world's burdens and step into the cockpit where only skill, judgment, and calm mattered. But today, the ritual was broken before it began. As he reached the aircraft door, Linda Cook stood there, arms folded, mouth curled into a performance-ready frown. Her voice rang out, not just for him, but for the benefit of the other crew, passengers trickling in, and anyone within earshot. "Captain Gaines, I need to see your credentials, again." The paperwork from security was unclear. "For everyone's safety, I'm going to document this." She held up her phone, camera app open, recording the exchange. Harold could hear the telltale chime of another phone capturing video behind him, one of the younger flight attendants, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and voyeuristic thrill. He could feel the crowd swelling behind him, the press of rolling suitcases, impatient sighs, and the click of smartphone cameras as passengers paused, curious. Some recognized his uniform, but most just saw an old black man being grilled by an assertive white woman in front of a line. Harold forced his features into neutrality as he produced his badge. "Again, Ms. Cook," he said, voice low. "Steady. You already checked this with security." Linda's reply was sharp, performative. "Company policy. Besides, some people think rules don't apply when they get old." Laughter rippled from the back of the line, the sound sharp as a slap. Harold's cheeks burned, but he made no move to protest. Every instinct from decades in the cockpit told him, don't give them a show, never let them see you rattle. Linda pressed on, panning her phone over his badge, his face, his trembling hands. "For the record, Captain Gaines, do you confirm you're authorized to operate this aircraft today?" "I confirm," Harold replied, his voice a quiet thunder. He could see the confusion, the skepticism, the fascination on the faces before him. Linda turned to the camera. "I hope corporate reviews this thoroughly. The safety of our crew and passengers is at stake." She tapped the stop button, then immediately began typing, lips pursed. Inside the cabin, passengers who had seen the spectacle whispered. An elderly white man in first class turned to his wife, voice just loud enough. "I thought they retired the old-timers. Maybe they'll get a real pilot in here before takeoff." Someone else muttered, "Didn't know they let pilots that old keep flying, or black for that matter." Harold walked the aisle in silence, feeling every eye. At the cockpit, his hands shook as he ran through the pre-flight checks. He tried to drown out the sounds, the whispers, the clicks, the nervous giggles from the forward galley, where Linda was showing her phone to two younger attendants. He remembered a time when his presence inspired confidence. Now, even the familiar switches and dials seemed cold, indifferent. He found himself checking every number twice, not out of caution, but out of anxiety. Would today be the day they finally found something to use against him? Midway through his checks, he caught a sliver of the conversation outside the cockpit door. "Seriously, Linda?" the junior attendant, Anna, asked. "Wasn't that a little much?" Linda's reply was icy. "I'm just looking out for the company. We don't need headlines about accidents. If he slips up, it's on us." Anna hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit. "Still, he's been here forever. My dad talks about him like a legend." Linda snorted. "Legends belong in museums, not cockpits. If you want to keep your job, you'd better learn that early." Harold's heart clenched. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself the way he always had before a storm. The boarding finished, but the tension lingered. As he made his final preparations, his phone buzzed. A new notification from the crew's internal group chat. "Safety alert. Senior pilot under review. See video," followed by a short clip. Linda confronting him, her voice crisp, his image blurry and stooped. In minutes, the reactions poured in. Some were mocking, others pitying, but none offered support. One comment, upvoted a dozen times. "Can't believe HR lets this slide. It's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Harold felt the humiliation physically, a heaviness behind his eyes, a dull ache in his chest. He could almost hear his late father's voice. "Don't let them see you break, Harry. Hold your head high, no matter what." But in this moment, alone in the cockpit, it was almost too much. He thought of his wife and daughter, his grandson, who sometimes boasted at school that his granddad could fly anything. What would they think if they saw him like this, reduced to a viral video, the butt of 1,000 jokes, a symbol of everything some people thought was wrong with the industry? As he sat there, staring at his trembling hands, a tear threatened to escape. He blinked it away. He would not cry here. Not in front of them, Not today. But when the door to the cockpit closed and the hum of the engine started up, Harold realized he'd never felt so alone in all his years in the sky. Far above the city, his spirit ached for the freedom he once felt behind the controls. But on the ground, he was a prisoner of rumor, of suspicion, and worst of all, of his own fading hope that dignity and hard work would ever be enough. The humiliation was complete. The pain was private. But Harold Gaines would not let this be the end of his story. As the door to the cockpit closed and Harold sat alone, the ache in his chest weighed heavier than ever. Sometimes, what hurts most isn't what people say in public. It's the silence of those who know better, but choose to say nothing at all. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt completely alone, even among your own colleagues? Or maybe you've seen someone publicly humiliated for something they couldn't control, like their age, their color, or just for being different. If you have, let us know in the comments. Sometimes, sharing your story is the first step in making things right. And if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter their years of service or the color of their skin, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. You never know whose life you might touch just by speaking up. The first hour of the flight was mechanical, almost numb. Captain Harold Gaines had learned long ago that when you're up at 35,000 feet, the world shrinks down to what's in front of you. Numbers, gauges, the subtle hum of jet engines, the way the yoke responds to a light touch. Up here, the noise of the terminal, the jeers, even the sting of public shame, all faded for a while. But today, not even the sky could keep out what was happening below. From the moment the plane pushed back from the gate, Harold could feel Linda's gaze burning a hole through the cockpit door. He didn't need to see her to know she was busy sowing seeds of doubt with the other crew and even the passengers. That's how it always started. Small, sharp words, spoken just loud enough. We'll have to see how this flight goes. I just hope the captain's up to it. Whispers spread faster than turbulence, and for the first time, Harold felt his hands tremble ever so slightly as he gripped the controls. His co-pilot, Jack Remington, glanced over now and then, his face polite, guarded, not hostile. But not exactly on Harold's side either. Caught in that awkward middle ground of, I just want to keep my job, Jack ran through the checklists with practiced efficiency. But their conversation was limited to the bare minimum. Gone was the camaraderie Harold remembered from his younger days, when two pilots shared war stories and jokes on the long hauls. Now, the silence said it all. Halfway through the climb, Linda radioed into the cockpit. Her voice, as always, sounded just a touch too loud, as if she wanted the entire front cabin to hear. Captain Gaines, we have a passenger in 2A who's concerned about your experience. She says she saw a video this morning on her phone, something about an investigation. Do you want to come out and address it? Harold could almost feel the trap snapping shut. He looked at Jack, who shrugged, avoiding eye contact. I'll speak to her after we reach cruising altitude, Harold replied, keeping his voice steady. But he knew the damage was done. Word was already spreading through the cabin, a slow infection of doubt and suspicion. He pictured the headlines. Pilot under investigation. Airline remains silent. Maybe that was the goal all along. At 38,000 feet, the plane hit a patch of rough air. Nothing dangerous, just enough turbulence to set drinks trembling and nerves jangling. Linda wasted no time. She made her way to the cockpit, knocked perfunctorily, then slid the door open a crack. Captain, a few passengers are getting anxious. Are you sure we're on the right flight path? Some of them have tight connections. Harold felt the sting of her words, questioning his judgment, sowing doubt in front of his co-pilot. He kept his eyes on the instruments. "We're on course and well within protocol, Ms. Cook. Turbulence is normal for this route." Linda leaned in just a bit farther. "It's just some of us would feel better with more transparency, especially given what's happened this morning." Jack shifted uncomfortably. "We're good, Linda. Captain Gaines is handling it by the book." But Linda wasn't satisfied. She stepped back into the galley and, loud enough for the front row to hear, said, "If anyone has concerns, I'm here to document them. Safety first. Always." By the time they began their descent into Houston, Harold's nerves were raw. The concerns had multiplied. Passengers pressing the call button, asking if the flight was safe, if the old pilot was really in charge. He kept his focus on landing the plane, hands as steady as ever. Touchdown was smooth, almost textbook. But as soon as the plane taxied to the gate, he knew something was wrong. Airport security vehicles were waiting outside the jet bridge. Too many. Too visible. Linda's eyes glittered with triumph as she collected her bag. "I'm sorry, Captain. I had no choice but to report what I saw. It's policy." Harold looked at her, searching for even a flicker of remorse, but found none. Instead, he saw satisfaction. The look of someone who'd finally tipped the scales. The passengers disembarked, some casting nervous glances his way, others avoiding his gaze entirely. A mother hustled her little girl past him, whispering, "Don't look, honey." He heard snatches of conversation. "Did you see the way he looked lost? I hope they get a younger crew next time." Security approached, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to the airline supervisor. Harold watched as they pulled Linda aside first, nodding solemnly at her every word. Then they turned to him. "Captain Gaines, could you come with us, please?" He swallowed the anger, the hurt. He gathered his bag and his dignity and walked off the plane, every step heavier than the last. Linda's voice trailed after him, falsely sweet. "Thank you for your service, Captain." Outside, the terminal buzzed with rumors. Already his phone was blowing up. Messages from the airline, his daughter, even a reporter. The world, it seemed, couldn't wait to see if the old legend would finally fall. As he was led through a side door, away from the main concourse, away from his crew, Harold glanced out at the ramp. The jets lined up for takeoff. For 50 years, this had been his kingdom. Now, with every whispered word and sideways glance, it was slipping away. But even as he was escorted into the cold, windowless room beyond, a single thought burned bright inside him. This isn't the end. Not yet. The walls were painted a tired shade of gray, with no windows, just a blinking fluorescent light and a security camera in one corner. Captain Harold Gaines sat alone at a metal table. His captain's hat placed carefully in front of him, as if it could shield him from what was coming next. He'd been here before, in rooms like this. Debriefings after emergencies, routine check-ins with flight operations, even the rare post-incident inquiry, but never like this. Never as a suspect, never as a man presumed guilty before the first question was even asked. He could hear muffled voices outside the door, the shuffle of shoes and the hush of anxious conversation. Every so often, someone glanced through the tiny window, their expression unreadable. Linda Cook had already walked by twice, her posture proud, eyes avoiding his. He recognized that kind of satisfaction, the feeling of someone who finally had the upper hand. He exhaled, tension releasing from his shoulders. "Yes, Denise, I didn't know who else to call. I wouldn't trouble you, but are you okay?" She interrupted, concern rising in her tone. "Is something wrong at the airport?" Harold glanced at the closed door, the empty interrogation room, the badge on the table. They're saying I'm not fit to fly, that I'm too old, maybe not even who I say I am. There's been an incident, and I need someone who remembers the truth. For a second, Denise Allen, the mayor of Atlanta, one of the city's most respected leaders, was just the little girl he'd rescued decades before, her hand tight in his, eyes full of fear and hope. He heard her inhale sharply. "You saved my life, Captain. You saved a lot of lives. Don't think for a second I've forgotten." Harold felt something like pride, but it hurt. "I'm sorry to call in a favor. I tried to fight this myself, but I'm tired, Denise. I'm tired of always having to prove I belong." He explained what had happened, the accusation at security, Linda's public humiliation, the whispers, the interrogation. Denise listened without interruption. When he finished, her voice was steely. "You shouldn't have to fight this battle alone, not after everything you've given this city, this industry. I'm coming down there right now. Don't sign a thing. Don't say a word until I get there." He wanted to protest, to say she shouldn't risk her position, but she cut him off. "No, Captain, not today. I owe you, and Atlanta owes you more than you know." She hung up, and for the first time since the ordeal began, Harold felt a flicker of hope, but the ache of shame lingered. Even when help was on the way, the humiliation didn't wash off so easily. A few minutes later, the HR rep and legal returned. "Is everything all right, Captain Gaines? Ready to cooperate?" Harold drew a long breath, straightened his jacket, and looked them dead in the eye. "My attorney is on the way, and so is the mayor of Atlanta." Their expressions shifted from confidence to worry. The legal man stammered, "The mayor?" "That's right," Harold said, holding their gaze. "You might want to call your bosses." Outside, the wheels of power began to turn. In a world of routine complaints and investigations, the sudden involvement of the mayor triggered calls up the airline's chain of command. In less than 20 minutes, the tone changed. Harold's phone buzzed with a message from an old friend in operations. "Hang tight, Harry. Big Boss is scrambling. You're not alone." The knock on the interrogation room door this time was firmer, more respectful. Denise Allen swept in. All business, suit crisp, presence commanding. With her was a lawyer and a local news crew trailing at a respectful distance. Their camera turned off for now. "Captain Gaines," she said, crossing the room. "I came as fast as I could." She extended her hand, not just as a politician, but as someone who remembered him as a hero. "I need to speak with your HR and legal, please. Privately." The HR manager tried to take charge. "This is an internal company investigation, ma'am. We can't involve." Denise cut her off. "You can and you will. This is a public matter now. The city of Atlanta will not allow one of its heroes to be railroaded by rumor and discrimination. We're going to do this by the book, but you'd better be sure your book is clean." She turned to Harold, voice softer. "Do you need water? Food? You've been in here a long time." Harold shook his head, the tightness in his chest easing a little. "I'm fine, thanks to you." Within minutes, the room was transformed. Airline executives joined via video call, each one suddenly more respectful, their voices full of apologies and concern. The HR representative stumbled through explanations, while legal grew increasingly nervous. Denise stood by Harold's side, listing his achievements for the record. Decades of service, the crash landing, the hundreds of lives he'd helped save, the pilots he'd mentored. She recounted his annual charity flights for sick children, the scholarships he'd funded for young pilots of color. One executive, faced with the mayor's quiet fury, finally cracked. "I'm not sure how this got so out of hand. We'll need to review our processes." Through it all, Harold remained dignified, answering questions clearly but without apology. For once, the burden of proof wasn't just on his shoulders. With Denise beside him, the room finally seemed to see the man. Not the rumors, not his age or the color of his skin, but the decades of honor behind his name. The meeting ended with promises of a thorough review, paid leave for his well-being, and a public statement clarifying there had been no wrongdoing on his part. The HR manager apologized on camera. Harold could tell it was more for PR than principle, but still, he'd survived the Inquisition. As he left the terminal with Denise, the Atlanta sun warming his face, he finally let himself breathe. There would be more battles ahead, more doubters and rumors, but for the first time in days, he didn't feel so alone. Denise squeezed his shoulder. "You're not done yet, Captain. Atlanta still needs you." Harold smiled, a little tired, a little proud. "Maybe I still need Atlanta too." News of the mayor's intervention spread through the airline like wildfire. By the time Harold reached home that evening, shoulders sore, head buzzing with exhaustion, the story had already hit the company intranet. Some called it a miracle. Others muttered about special treatment, but for the first time in days, Harold felt something that had been missing: solidarity. He had barely stepped inside when his phone began to ring. The first call was from Charles Evans, a retired captain who'd trained Harold decades ago. Charles' voice was gravely, but urgent. "Heard about what happened, Harry. Damn shame. But I'm proud you stood tall. Don't let them rewrite your legacy, son. If you need me, you call." Harold thanked him, emotion threatening to crack his voice. Next came a flood of texts and emails, some from pilots he barely knew, others from old friends who'd quietly watched the drama unfold. Saw what Linda did, not the first time. "You did nothing wrong. If you need a statement from a witness, I'll give it. Time for this nonsense to stop." Even Jack Remington, the young co-pilot from that morning, reached out. "Captain, I want you to know I backed you up in my statement. I told HR you handled everything by the book, and then some. If they need me again, I'll speak up." Harold read each message slowly, letting them sink in. The shame and isolation from that morning didn't vanish, but now there was a small bulwark against it, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. Later that evening, Denise Allen called again. This time, her voice was less formal. "You did well today, Captain. Tomorrow, I'll hold a press conference about workplace dignity and respect. Would you mind standing with me? The city needs to see who you are, what you stand for." He hesitated, unused to the idea of being the public face of anything. He'd always preferred the quiet professionalism of the cockpit, far above the noise. But he knew this was bigger than pride. "I'll be there," Harold replied quietly. That night, Harold found sleep difficult. His mind wandered back through decades, training flights where he was the only black man in the room, long hauls where he'd broken every stereotype just by showing up, moments of quiet victory and nights of silent grief. He remembered advice from his old mentor, Captain Evans. "Some days, you'll be the only one in your corner. Those are the days you prove what you're made of." By morning, the city was abuzz. The press conference was scheduled for noon in the City Hall's marble rotunda. Denise stood at the podium, the local news cameras ready. She began with a story about the crash Harold had survived, the lives he'd saved, and how he'd always insisted he was just doing his job. She didn't shy away from the ugly reality of workplace discrimination. She named it, challenged it, and asked the city to do better. Then she called Harold forward. He stood, hands clasped behind his back, every inch the dignified captain, despite the in his bones. Captain Gaines has given this city more than most will ever know, Denise said, her voice carrying through the hall. His dignity is a reminder that our workplaces must reflect our best values, not our worst instincts. He is not alone. None of us are, when we stand together. Applause filled the hall. Reporters asked questions about policy, training, accountability. Harold answered what he could, but mostly he let Denise do the talking. He knew his strength wasn't in speeches, but in showing up, day after day, with quiet integrity. Afterward, several young pilots and flight attendants approached Harold in the hall. Some were black, others Latino, a few women. Faces he'd seen on the line, but never really known. One, a nervous young woman, handed him a note. "Thank you for surviving so the rest of us could even try." Harold's throat tightened. He realized that while he'd felt utterly alone in those interrogation rooms and cockpits, he'd actually been carrying hope for people he'd never met. His fight was theirs, too. As the day faded, the airline released a new statement. They would be reviewing all complaints of discrimination with an outside committee. They named Harold as an advisor for diversity and inclusion, but he knew titles meant little without change. Still, it was a start. At home, Harold's daughter called. Her voice trembled with pride. "Granddad," his little grandson said in the background, "are you going to be on TV? You're my hero." For the first time in days, Harold laughed, a deep, honest sound. "I'm not sure about TV, kiddo, but I'll always fly for you. Yoto." That night, Harold sat on his porch, looking out over the city lights. He thought about legacy, not the medals or news stories, but the courage to show up, tell the truth, and stand tall even when it hurt. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he was never truly fighting alone. Audience interaction. Have you ever had someone stand up for you when you felt completely alone? Or have you been that person for someone else? Share your story in the comments below. And if you believe standing together makes us all stronger, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. You never know whose courage you might inspire. The days after the press conference brought an uneasy calm and then a storm. For the first time since his ordeal began, Harold Gaines allowed himself to believe things might get better. There were handshakes in the halls of the airline's Atlanta office, cautious nods from executives who'd avoided his gaze just a week before. Denise Allen's speech had gone viral, with social media hashtags calling for dignity and fairness, not just in aviation, but in every workplace. But for every message of support, there was another lurking in the shadows, a nasty email, a muttered threat, anonymous online comments that called Harold a token or washed-up old man who pulled the race card. He tried not to read them, but even turning off his phone couldn't keep the poison out. Some colleagues who'd privately supported him before now kept their distance, afraid of being targeted themselves. At home, Harold kept busy. He walked the neighborhood, greeting old friends who remembered him from the days he'd grill at the block party. At church, he sat in the back pew, letting the gospel songs soothe the ache in his chest. But even there, he felt exposed. Too many people recognized him now, came up to thank him, or whispered with concern. One afternoon, his grandson, Marcus Jr., came running in from school, backpack bouncing. "Granddad, they talked about you in class. My teacher said you're a hero." Harold smiled, ruffled the boy's hair. "Is that so? Yeah, but some kids said old people shouldn't fly planes. I told them you could land anything." Harold hugged his grandson a little tighter, feeling the warmth of legacy and the chill of what prejudice could do to the next generation. But outside the comfort of home, pressure mounted. The airline's outside review committee started scheduling interviews. Harold was summoned again to headquarters. This time, not to defend his license, but to offer insight on how to make things better. The HR director, a young white woman named Ms. Porter, greeted him with forced enthusiasm. "We're committed to real change, Captain Gaines. We want your story to help us train the next generation of pilots and crew." Harold nodded. He'd heard words like these before when they first hired him, when they needed a face for a diversity brochure, when they wanted to settle lawsuits quietly. Still, he spoke honestly. He described the loneliness, the constant scrutiny, the feeling of being an outsider, even after decades of service. He didn't sugarcoat what Linda Cook and others had done, but he didn't call for vengeance either. "People need to be held accountable," he said. "But what we need most is a culture that actually respects what we claim to value." Ms. Porter made notes, nodded, thanked him for his candor. "We'll be in touch." That afternoon, Harold got a call from Charles Evans, his old mentor. Heard the committees poking around. Don't trust them to fix this on their own. They're just trying to protect the brand. Harold agreed, but what could he do? He was tired, mentally, physically, emotionally. He thought of retiring early, just slipping away while the firestorm was hot. But then he remembered all those young pilots who had come up to him after the press conference, the quiet thank yous, the nervous hope in their eyes. If he walked away now, what would happen to them? One evening, a black sedan rolled slowly past Harold's house, windows tinted. He noticed it linger, turned the corner, then come back again. He didn't panic, but he did call Denise. "Just letting you know, I think someone's trying to scare me." Denise's reply was immediate. "I'll notify the city police. Don't take any risks, Harold. They want you rattled." The threats escalated. Someone spray-painted a slur on his garage door. The news ran stories about division at the airline and hinted at simmering racial tensions without ever naming Linda Cook or those who'd fueled the fire. Harold's daughter pleaded with him to move in with her. He declined. He wouldn't let hate run him out of his home. Inside the airline, meanwhile, the backlash grew sharper. Linda, now on leave pending the investigation, hired a lawyer and began her own media campaign. She claimed Harold had intimidated her, played the age and race card, and risked the safety of everyone on board. Several anonymous crew members, almost all white, corroborated her version of events. The company, nervous about its image, issued carefully neutral statements about ongoing reviews and commitment to safety for all. It would have been easy for Harold to feel alone again, but something inside him had changed. Every insult or threat reminded him that the struggle was bigger than just his name. The old fear of losing his dignity, of ending his career in disgrace, had faded. What remained was a quiet, stubborn fire. He went to every committee meeting he was invited to, brought records of previous complaints from other black and minority staff, and encouraged others to speak up. When reporters knocked on his door, he spoke softly, but honestly. He never attacked Linda or her allies directly. Instead, he kept returning to what mattered. "I want every pilot and flight attendant to be judged by their actions, not their age, not their color. You can't call something a family if you only care about some of the members." Eventually, others began to echo his words. A Latina first officer, Maria Rodriguez, bravely shared her own story of being undermined. A young white flight attendant, to everyone's surprise, admitted to seeing Linda orchestrate similar concerns about others who didn't fit her mold. Bit by bit, the silence cracked. One morning, Harold received a handwritten letter from a passenger, someone he'd never met. "Captain Gaines, I was on your flight that day. I saw what happened, and I want you to know you made me feel safe in the sky. I told my daughter about you. I hope you never stop flying." Harold pinned the letter above his desk. It reminded him that beyond the headlines, the noise, the hate, there were people quietly rooting for him and for something better. The airline's review committee announced it would recommend major changes: new anti-discrimination policies, independent oversight of complaints, and mandatory diversity training, not just for staff, but for management as well. Some called it window dressing, but for Harold, it was a first crack in the wall. The breaking point came when Linda's lawyer threatened to sue both Harold and the airline for defamation. For the first time, the company's top brass asked Harold how he wanted to respond. He took a deep breath and said, "The truth, nothing more. Let the record show who did what." That evening, Harold sat on his porch watching the sun set. He thought of his grandson, of Denise, of all the lives he'd touched, and the battle still ahead. He was tired, but he wasn't broken. If anything, he'd never felt stronger. The phone call came early one morning, one of those crisp, cloudless days when Atlanta felt full of promise. Harold Gaines had barely sipped his first cup of coffee when his old friend and union rep, Samuel Holt, rang his cell. "Harry, I've got something for you," Sam said, urgency in his voice. "You need to see these files. Some people have finally had enough of the lies." It turned out the company's much-lauded outside review was digging deeper than anyone expected. Whispers from inside HR suggested they'd discovered old complaint logs that had been quietly buried or dismissed. For years, crew members who didn't fit the airline's unspoken mold, Black, Latino, older, female, or simply different, had filed incident reports only for them to vanish without action. Sam met Harold in a quiet corner booth at their favorite diner, a spot where everyone knew them, but gave them privacy when needed. Sam handed over a worn manila envelope stuffed with photocopies and notes. "It's all in there, Harry. Names, dates, statements. Linda Cook's been at this a long time, and she's not alone." Harold's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of vindication. The file included copies of emails between Linda and 2 other flight attendants, plotting concerns about Black pilots or questionable older crew. There were notes showing when complaints were made and then ignored by management. With signatures he recognized, the pattern was unmistakable, but Harold knew evidence meant little if it stayed in the shadows. He picked up his phone and dialed Denise Allen, the mayor, who had become more than an ally. She was now his strongest advocate. "Denise, we finally have something concrete," he said, his voice steady. "Real evidence, not just my word." She didn't hesitate. "Let's make sure it doesn't get buried again. I'll call the city's labor relations director and the press. If you're ready, Captain, we'll make this public." For a moment, Harold let the sense of possibility settle in. This was what he'd hoped for, but it meant putting everything on the line: his name, his legacy, even his family's privacy. He went for a walk to clear his head, memories crowding in. The years of swallowing insults, letting jokes slide for the sake of peace, holding his tongue as less experienced pilots got promoted ahead of him. He remembered his father's voice from another lifetime. Sometimes you have to be the one who says enough, even if it costs you everything. Harold returned home and called a meeting of the small group of allies who had stood with him through the storm. Maria Rodriguez, the young Latina first officer, Jack Remington, his co-pilot, and even Ms. Porter from HR, who by now had quietly started advocating for change from within. They gathered in his living room, the walls lined with photos from Harold's career, a lifetime of uniforms, medals, and smiles with grateful passengers. He spread out the documents on the coffee table. "This is it," he said quietly. "If we do this, there's no turning back. They'll fight dirty, they'll try to discredit us, scare us off, but if we stay quiet, it'll never stop." Maria nodded. I've waited my whole career for someone to say what we all know. I'll go on record. Jack spoke up. I've already started a group chat with other crew who've seen Linda pull these stunts. Some are ready to sign statements, Ms. Porter added. This won't be easy. Management will circle the wagons, but the review committee is finally listening and the press is watching. We have leverage. For the next week, they gathered stories, coordinated statements, and met with lawyers. Harold's old friend Samuel, bringing in legal support from the pilots' union, and even the NWACP. They strategized carefully, knowing a single misstep could destroy not just Harold, but the credibility of every witness who came forward. Meanwhile, the airline tried to get ahead of the scandal. Press releases touted a new era of transparency and diversity. But inside, pressure mounted for everyone involved. Jack was called into private meetings, questioned for hours about his loyalty. Maria received anonymous messages warning her to think carefully about your career. Even Ms. Porter found her calendar suddenly filled with tedious, last-minute compliance reviews, a clear sign the old guard was nervous. Despite the intimidation, their resolve held. Denise Allen held a City Hall press conference, flanked by Harold and a handful of his allies. She spoke of dignity, the price of silence, and the need for a system where pilots and crew were valued for their skill and integrity, not judged by age, color, or gender. The real bombshell dropped when a national news network picked up the story. Reporters requested interviews with Harold and Maria, asking pointed questions about the airline's culture. The file of evidence was submitted to both the Department of Transportation and the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Suddenly, the company's legal team was in crisis mode. One by one, other crew members, Black, Latino, Asian, and even white, added their voices. Old complaints resurfaced. Social media filled with stories from past and present employees. The narrative changed from one man's grudge to systemic rot in the heart of the airline. Linda Cook, under mounting legal pressure, released a statement blaming poor communication and misunderstandings, but the damage was done. Her allies distanced themselves, and the company quietly placed her on indefinite suspension. Harold didn't feel triumphant, just relieved and deeply tired. He knew there would be more battles, lawsuits, union meetings, more attempts at character assassination. But for the first time, he sensed the tide turning. A letter arrived that evening, handwritten, addressed simply, Captain Gaines. Inside, a short note. I flew with you once, years ago. You inspired me to become a pilot, even when it seemed impossible. Thank you for fighting so I can keep flying. Harold read it twice, hands steady, tears threatening. It reminded him why he'd risked everything, not for vengeance, but so the sky could belong to anyone who dreamed. As the sun set over Atlanta, Harold sat quietly with his allies. Each of them changed by the fight, all of them a little braver than before. The evidence was out, the world was watching, and the wall of silence had finally begun to crack. Tomorrow would bring more questions, maybe more pain. But tonight, for the first time in months, Harold felt peace. He had spoken his truth, and the world had finally started to listen. For weeks, tension had simmered throughout the airline and the city. Rumors swirled about lawsuits, federal investigations, and the fate of Captain Harold Gaines. The press conference with Mayor Denise Allen had brought the fight into the open, but the real reckoning arrived on a rainy Thursday morning when the airline scheduled an official disciplinary hearing. A moment everyone understood was about much more than one man's job. Harold arrived early. He wore his full dress uniform, medals gleaming, shoes shined to a mirror polish. His daughter insisted on driving him, wanting to show her support in the face of the cameras waiting outside the building. "You don't have to do this alone, Dad," she said quietly, squeezing his hand before he stepped into the lobby. But once inside, Harold was on his own. The hearing room was cold, brightly lit, and lined with polished oak. On one side, a panel of airline executives and legal counsel. On the other, Harold, his union reps Sam Holt and Maria Rodriguez, the young first officer who'd bravely spoken up. A handful of reporters waited outside in the hall, ears pressed to the door. The company's lawyer began. "Captain Gaines, you stand accused of conduct unbecoming, creating a hostile environment, and causing distress to crew and passengers. Do you have a response?" Harold looked around, searching for any hint of fairness in their faces. He found mostly fear, of scandal, of change, of losing the old ways. "Yes, I do," he answered, voice calm and steady. "I have spent over 50 years flying safely. Not once have I put a crew or a passenger at risk. The accusations against me were manufactured by those who didn't want someone like me in the left seat. But I am not alone in saying so." He presented the file Sam and the others had built, evidence of repeated false complaints, statements from multiple witnesses, even old email threads showing a pattern of discrimination. Maria spoke next. "I flew with Captain Gaines that day. He was nothing but professional. I've seen real incompetence. This wasn't it. What happened here is what's happened to a lot of us for a long time. We keep quiet, and they hope we go away." As the evidence mounted, the panel shifted uncomfortably. One executive, an older man who'd flown with Harold in years past, looked down at his hands. Another, younger and newly hired, asked, "Why didn't anyone speak up before?" Sam answered, blunt and honest, "Because every time someone did, it disappeared." This is a chance for the company to actually change, or just pretend again. They called Linda Cook to testify. She appeared via video, her lawyer at her side. She repeated her claims, concerns about safety, uncertainty about credentials. But when pressed for specifics, her story unraveled. The panel confronted her with evidence, the old emails, the pattern of targeting. Linda faltered, and her lawyer advised her to take the fifth. As the morning wore on, other voices joined in. Maria read statements from other crew members who'd felt targeted or sidelined. An older white mechanic, quietly brave, spoke of watching complaints disappear or being pressured to change his statements. The hearing became less about Harold and more about the culture itself. Finally, they gave Harold the last word. He stood, hat in hand, back straight as ever. "I love this job. I always have. But I shouldn't have to fight twice as hard, every day, just to be allowed to do it. I'm not here for revenge. I just want the next generation to know they can show up and be treated fairly, no matter who they are or how long they've served." He sat down, and the room was silent. The panel adjourned for deliberation. It took hours. Hours in which Harold and his allies paced the hallway. Reporters asking for quotes. Friends and family texting support. When the door finally opened, the airline's CEO stood at the front. "We have reviewed all evidence. Captain Gaines, we find no grounds for disciplinary action. You are fully exonerated. The company will begin a full audit of past complaints and disciplinary actions and implement new oversight to prevent this from happening again. We owe you, and many others, an apology." Maria hugged him. Sam clapped him on the back. Harold's daughter wept openly in the hall. Even some of the company staff, people who'd kept their heads down for years, smiled as he passed. That evening, the news reported not only Harold's vindication, but also the coming changes at the airline. Denise Allen issued a statement praising the courage of all who spoke up, and the union called for a nationwide review of airline hiring and disciplinary practices. Harold celebrated quietly at home, surrounded by family and a handful of friends who'd never lost faith. He was tired, so tired, but for the first time in months, he felt at peace. The battle had been brutal, but it wasn't for nothing. The wall had finally cracked. He looked at his grandson across the dinner table. "Granddad," the boy asked, "does this mean you're going to keep flying?" Harold smiled. "If they'll have me, son. If not, maybe I'll just teach others to do it better." Audience interaction. Have you ever witnessed someone brave enough to speak up, even when the odds were against them? Or maybe you've had to fight for what's right at work or in your community. Share your story in the comments below, and let us know what standing up for justice means to you. If you believe change is possible when we stick together, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories that inspire. The news of Harold Gaines's exoneration swept through the airline community like a fresh spring wind. For weeks, crew rooms and flight lounges buzzed with talk. Some voices shocked, others quietly relieved, a few even jubilant. But for Harold, the change felt different. It wasn't a parade or a standing ovation. Instead, it was in the quiet things. A nod from a pilot who'd never spoken to him before, the way a young flight attendant asked him to sign her training log, or the look of genuine respect from managers who'd always kept their distance. One morning, as Harold prepared for a routine flight to Dallas, he noticed new posters on the crew room wall. Zero tolerance for discrimination. Report safety and fairness concerns. Below, for the first time, the phone number actually rang through to a real person, not just an empty voicemail. He took a moment, hand on the poster, letting the truth of it settle in. He had not started this fight to become a symbol, but here he was, a living reminder that change, though painfully slow, was possible. Maria Rodriguez was promoted to captain, her achievement celebrated in a company bulletin. Jack Remington, the young co-pilot, volunteered for the company's new diversity and ethics board. Even Ms. Porter, the HR manager, gained fresh respect for championing real reform, her inbox now full of thank you notes from crew members who'd found new courage to speak. Yet, not everything changed overnight. Linda Cook quietly resigned, her circles shrinking as the old guard realized the game had shifted. Some skeptics still grumbled in corners, but the silence that had protected prejudice for years had been broken. Harold's daughter insisted on a small family dinner to celebrate. There, surrounded by 3 generations, his daughter, her husband, and his grandson. Harold finally let the weight of the ordeal roll off his shoulders. "Granddad," his grandson piped up, "are you going to fly forever?" Harold chuckled. "Maybe not forever, but I'm not done yet." He looked at his daughter, her eyes shining with pride. "You taught me to fight, Dad," she said softly. "You taught all of us." That night, Harold stood by his window, looking out at the Atlanta skyline. He thought of the young pilots, the crew, the quiet ones in every workplace who still needed someone to go first. He knew the system wasn't perfect, but it was better. And maybe, just maybe, it would keep getting better. He breathed in the southern night, feeling, for the first time in a long time, truly free. 3 months after the hearing, the air in Atlanta felt lighter, maybe just a little cleaner. At the airport, a new kind of energy buzzed among the crew. People no longer whispered behind Harold's back. Now, they met his eyes, greeted him by name, and sometimes simply said, "Thank you," as he passed by. On the morning of his first flight back as senior captain, Harold paused at the gate, taking in the view of his Boeing 737. The terminal was busy as ever, but he could sense the difference. A few younger pilots gathered nearby, watching him not just with curiosity, but with real admiration. Jack Remington stood by the jet bridge, giving him a respectful nod. "Ready, Captain?" he asked, a little grin on his face. "Ways," Harold replied, his voice steady. As he walked onto the plane, he noticed the cabin crew smiling, Maria Rodriguez among them, now wearing her new captain's stripes. She winked as she checked the pre-flight paperwork. Once the cockpit door closed, Harold sat in the left seat. He ran his hands over the controls like an old friend, settling into a rhythm that had always felt like home. For a moment, he thought of the journey. Every late night, every indignity, every small victory. He remembered the people who stood with him: Denise, Maria, Sam, his daughter, his grandson, and so many silent allies. Before pushback, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harold Gaines, speaking for myself and Captain Rodriguez. We're honored to have you aboard today. Thank you for trusting us with your journey." There was something different in his tone, a weight lifted, a pride unhidden. As the aircraft soared over the city, Harold glanced down at the skyline, sunlight reflecting off glass towers and winding highways. For years, he'd fought not just for his own dignity, but for everyone who ever felt invisible, doubted, or dismissed. After touchdown, as passengers deplaned, an older gentleman stopped at the cockpit door. "I read about you, Captain. I flew in Korea a lifetime ago. It's good to see the world catching up." Harold shook the man's hand, humbled and grateful. "Thank you for paving the way, sir." Back at home that evening, Harold sat with his grandson on the porch, watching the planes blink through the dusk. "Do you ever get scared, Granddad?" Harold smiled. "Not anymore. Not with family and friends standing with me." His phone buzzed. A new message from Maria. "Thanks for helping us believe again." He put his arm around his grandson and let himself hope, for the first time in a long time, that the next chapter would be easier for everyone who followed. In 5 major airports, Germany announced SkyGrid-compatible monitors in its regional jets. Australia pledged research funding to develop accent-sensitive voice analysis modules to ensure no passenger is penalized for speaking with an accent. Each delegate shared personal stories. An Indian representative explained how rural women in Hyderabad, once afraid to fly alone, were now booking seats because they felt assured they'd be treated fairly. A South Korean airline exec described how silent discrimination, legitimate complaints being ignored, had plummeted to near zero. Naomi listened from one side of the table, her expression neutral. But inside, her heart swelled. These weren't just data points. They were human lives reshaped. The next morning, in a small church auditorium in rural Georgia, Naomi joined a town hall gathering for local residents. The room was packed, some standing, because people had traveled miles to attend. A teenage girl stood at the microphone. She wore a Girl Scout sash and held a piece of paper nervously. "Dr. Sinclair, I wrote a report for my civics class about you and the Sky Grid. My mom used to be scared of flying because pilots told her she might interfere with their shift. Now she flies to see her grandchildren without fear." Naomi crouched to meet her eye level. "You should be proud. Sharing stories changes minds. That's how we build a better system." She ruffled the girl's hair, and the audience, mostly seniors, clapped. A local pastor, Father Miguel Reyes, then said, "We've seen a minister's wife recently travel back home for her mother's funeral without a single staff member questioning her wheelchair. That's because someone cared enough to share her story with SkyGrid. We say grace for that logic." The congregation laughed, then applauded again. Naomi felt a gentle warmth spread across her chest, an affirmation that real lives were touched, not just policies. On her flight back to D.C., Naomi settled into 4C. She glanced around, the toddler in the hijab, now giggling as her father played peekaboo from the aisle, the elderly man with a cane offering his seat to a pregnant woman, the couple in 8A toasting with sparkling juice, their flight uneventful, even mundane. She pulled out her tablet and checked live FJI metrics. Average crew empathy score, 92.3. National ethics compliance rate, 90. Passenger satisfaction index, 4.8. Factor 5. She let out a quiet sigh. Good numbers, but she knew the work wasn't finished. That evening, as twilight painted the Capitol's reflecting pool in shades of pink, Naomi walked along Constitution Avenue. She paused before a small monument to early aviators, Orville and Wilbur Wright, Amelia Earhart, people who had once dreamed of humans conquering the skies. They took flight for freedom. Naomi's generation was taking flight for dignity. Her phone buzzed. It was an alert from SkyGrid. New report. First-grade pilot at Eclipse Jet failed to follow protocol. Disrupted passenger without verification. That score would drop within hours. An internal email would go out to Eclipse. Review in 24 hours or face ground hold. She whipped the phone off, slipping it into her pocket. No indulgence in smug satisfaction. Her work required constant vigilance. Instead, she lifted her gaze to the horizon, senses attuned to the hum of passing cars, the chatter of tourists, the rush of life. 2 nights later, a small contingent of Flight Justice Index developers gathered at SkyGrid HQ for a celebratory dinner. Pizza, salad, and cookies. Simple fare. They toasted one another with sparkling cider. Alex raised his glass. To Dr. Sinclair, you believed we could code compassion. They clinked glasses. Naomi smiled genuinely. To all of you, you turned an idea into an ecosystem. You made flying a little more human. A junior data engineer who'd been part of initial FJI beta grinned. Remember when we thought 50% coverage was impossible? Now it's not. Laughter. A few relieved exhalations. They knew they were writing history in real time. The following morning, Naomi visited her old high school in Bethesda, Maryland, Oak Crest Academy. She was invited to speak to the junior class about leadership, ethics, and technology. The auditorium brimmed with 15-year-olds, some doodling on notebooks, others glued to phones. She took the stage. 20 years ago, I sat where you are. I was the kid who liked coding more than pep rallies. I cared about fairness, whether in classroom elections or in computer games. I never imagined that one day I'd be changing how people experience flight. But it all started with a belief that no one should be told they don't belong just because of who they are or what they look like. A hand shot up. Did you ever get scared? Like, what if no one cared? She paused. Of course. Many times. But I learned that courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right despite fear. And sometimes, people will care. Maybe even thousands of people you've never met. They scribbled notes, some faces lighting up with first flicker of possibility. Later that afternoon, Naomi walked through her childhood neighborhood. She passed the corner store where she used to buy candy, the community center where her dad taught Sunday school, the park where she chased after her little brother. She paused by the wrought iron gate of her family's former home, now a modest but respectable rental duplex. She remembered sitting at that kitchen table, pleading with her parents to let her build a computer from spare parts. They'd encouraged her. They told her, "If you can dream it, you can code it." She smiled, thinking how far those words had carried her. At dusk, back at SkyGrid HQ, Naomi finally closed her laptop, leaned back in her chair, and exhaled with a rare sigh of contentment. She thought of the toddler with the hijab, the elderly man with the cane, and the young pilot whose drone had first captured that video on Flight CS-147's cabin. The world had changed since that fateful day, but she also thought of the pilots still learning to empathize, the passengers still waiting for their stories to matter, the international partners still crafting local versions of the FJI. Her work was never truly done. She stood, zipped up her leather jacket, and walked out into the night. The city lights sparkled behind her like a constellation of opportunity and promise. Above, a plane roared past, heading west. For a moment, Naomi held her breath, listening to that engine hum. Then she smiled. Because for once, the sky didn't feel limitless in ambition alone. It felt limitless in fairness, in dignity, in the simple knowledge that from now on, no one would be erased without consequence. She walked on, knowing that as long as people still flew, her mission endured.